civilian role that I have now. And so I've been working over the years supporting A3 on a variety of topics related to command and control, specifically what was first called multi-domain C2, and then more recently joint all-domain operations, and as well getting into some things having to do with operations in the information environment. And so what we wanted to do with this presentation today was to talk a little bit about this thing that we are calling JADO, and try to explain, you know, what is behind all this, what does all this language that you might be seeing mean, and kind of give you sort of a grounding on what this subject is all about. So, Cass, if we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so across the DoD, we are seeing all kinds of stuff out there in the open press and within DoD publications on terms such as MDO, JADO, JADC2, OIE. And so what does all this stuff mean? You know, what are they trying to get at? What's different today that is causing us to introduce all this new language? And more concretely and more fundamentally, what problem are we trying to address with this? These are the things I'd like to get after, to sort of baseline everybody and provide us all with a foundation on what is this language all about, and sort of demystify some of this stuff that's out there, and then talk a little bit about where the Air Force is today, and what are we doing about it, and where do we go from here, and what does it mean for you, and how can you learn more about this as all of you go forward at SOS and also in your Air Force careers. Next slide, please. So there's any given day, there will be a variety of articles out there that will speak to all domain operations, JADC2, things that the Chief of Staff of the Air Force has been talking about, things that the other services are talking about. And so there's a lot of discussion out there. And one thing that I've noticed about all these articles is that they don't do a particularly good job of explaining, well, what exactly is this thing? Is it just a new buzzword? Is there something substantive here? Is there some real meat or specificity here? You know, are we really talking about some new idea, or is it just an old idea wrapped up in new buzzwords? And that can be frustrating. That can be frustrating for operators who are trying to understand, well, what is it that I'm supposed to do differently as part of a planning staff? It can be frustrating for policymakers who have to understand, you know, what are some things that we might need to do differently in the Air Force to be effective at doing some of this stuff. And it can be frustrating for technologists to not quite know what is it that we are trying to build and how does it need to look different than what we've done in the past. And so again, that's kind of what I would like to try to address as we go through this talk over the next half hour. Next slide, please. So first of all, before we get into all the specifics of it, when we talk about this word domain, what do we actually mean by that? So interestingly, there's no military doctrinal definition of the word domain itself. Obviously, that word means something in the English language to all of us colloquially, but the dictionary will tell us that a domain might be an area of territory that a particular ruler or government owns or controls. It could be a place where certain kinds of activities take place. And the more sort of fuzzy definition is something called a sphere of activity, knowledge, or influence that has certain characteristics. And so one of the challenges that we have with this subject area is that nobody really agrees on what a domain is. Now that said, specific domains that are of concern to the military have been defined. So we've got space, air, land, maritime, and then what's called the information environment on the right there, which contains the cyberspace domain. So even though we haven't necessarily done a good job of explaining what the word domain might mean from a military point of view, we at least have some understanding of how it is we are dividing up the Earth into separate parts where there are separate considerations and that apply to military activities that take place there. So that gives us a starting point for starting to talk about some of this stuff. And so in parentheses, what you see on this slide are references to the joint publications, the joint doctrinal documents that actually explain all these things as we go through it. But anyways, so those are all for reference for you. I assume you'll have access to these slides afterwards to be able to get to this stuff later. But that's where you can look for some of these things. Next slide. So before we start talking about what's happening today and what is the language that we are introducing, let's first maybe say a little bit about what are some key long-standing terms that have been around for quite a while that are important to all this stuff. So first is the idea of a joint force, which is simply a force that consists of elements that are coming from 2 or more military departments under a single commander. There's the idea of joint operations then, which are actions conducted by such joint forces. Then the idea of combined arms is the third thing on the slide there, basically, which has to do with integrating different combinations of arms to achieve complementary effects. And so a lot of people, this whole idea of joint all-domain operations is really just about that, combined arms. So this is a term that's been around for quite some time. And so before we get caught up in the current buzzwords, it's worthwhile to know that some of these ideas have been around for quite some time. And then finally, command and control. Before we start talking about this thing called joint all-domain C2, what is command and control to begin with? Quite simply, from a doctrinal point of view, it's a commander exercising authority and direction to assign attached forces to accomplish some specified mission. So remember these terms because these are all pretty foundational and fundamental to everything else that we are going to talk about. Next slide, please. Okay, so then here are some new terms that have started to emerge over the last couple of years. The first being joint all-domain operations, and the second being joint all-domain C2. And I'll spoiler alert, I don't like these terms. I didn't come up with them, but I will say quite candidly that I don't find them to be terribly satisfying. So the first one there, as you can see, from my point of view, it's kind of laying out, okay, well, what is this supposed to be in terms of getting at what the force is doing? But it's adding a lot of complexity to the definition that we had on the previous slide on joint operations or combined arms, but it doesn't tell you anything about what's different. And then when you look at the definition of joint all-domain command and control, it's talking about art and science, about rapidly translating decisions into action, but it's not as clear as what was on the previous slide on the definition of command and control when it comes to basically a commander exercising authority and direction over their forces. And so, so just recognize that these are the terms that are out there, but from my own personal point of view, I don't find them to be terribly effective or useful at driving the actions that we want to be able to take out of this stuff. But this is what we've got right now. So let's try to peel this back and kind of get at some of the fundamentals and foundational things that are really behind this thing. Next slide, please. So what are we actually talking about? So strip away all the buzzwords and everything else. First, there's the basic idea of combining forces and capabilities from multiple domains or multiple disciplines to be able to achieve outcomes that might not be possible by actions in a single domain or actions by a single type of force. So that's kind of point number one. The second point is being able to then synchronize the actions of those forces to create the desired effects where and when the commander wants to, also known as command and control. So this whole, the icon there is sort of meant to communicate the idea of bringing together everything you want, where and when you want it. A third piece of it is being able to counter vulnerabilities or adversary actions in one domain using stuff from other domains. And the last thing, which you might see in some of the doctrine that we started to publish recently, is this idea of creating multiple dilemmas for an adversary through combined action that forces them to make a decision between 2 or more undesirable alternatives. And so a bunch of ideas that we are trying to get at with this thing that we are calling JADO. Next slide. But now again, we might ask ourselves, are these things really new? Well, perhaps not, perhaps they are, but there are many examples of these kinds of things. Kind of working our way across this slide, we can look at the Peloponnesian War, which I'm sure any history student there is familiar with, between Athens and Sparta from a multi-domain lens. Each of them has spent decades concentrating on combat in their preferred domain, Athens at sea and Sparta on land, and had built strategies that reflected those advantages that each of them had. And neither of them wanted to challenge the other on its favorite domain. Athens tried to lure Sparta into large fleet-on-fleet engagements, while Sparta repeatedly tried to bait Athens into pitched land battles, and these asymmetries made it very difficult for each side to attack the other's center of gravity. Now that was a while ago. What's changed since then? Something that might be a more contemporary example is the Doolittle raid that followed the Japanese
All right, hey folks, it looks like Dr. Mulgund's house just lost power. So stand by for troubleshooting. All right, folks, it looks like Dr. Mulgund is getting his computer back up. He had a little bit of a short power outage, so he's got to get his router and Wi-Fi pulled back up. Great opportunity to stretch some legs, grab a cup of coffee, maybe throw some more questions over into the Q&A there, and we will get back going here momentarily. Thanks for your patience.
Hey, Nick, this is Colonel Babcock. I can answer a couple of the Q&A to pass the time.
All right, roger that, sir. If you want to pop off of, get your video going, and we can pitch that over to him.
Right now it says my video is disabled, but I can just answer the questions if nobody cares. They
Okay.
don't need to see my face. It's not that good looking.
Roger that, sir. Real quick, if you wouldn't mind, just let the students know who you are and where you work for over there.
Okay, this is Colonel Babcock. I go by SAC. I started out over when I moved to Maxwell to the Doctrine Development Center. So we were given the task by the Chief of Staff of the Air Force to write Joint All-Domain Operations Doctrine. We initially pushed back and tried to discuss the idea of multi-domain operations, and that when you come together as multiple services, then joint all-domain. But then General Goldfein said, I don't want that. I want all of our airmen to be thinking joint from the get-go. So operations. So the kind of is the question about how to reflect the next capsule similar to MDO. To be honest, multi-domain operations. Again, that was our druthers initially, but we were trumped by the highest 4-star in the Air Force, so we called it Joint All-Domain Operations. And more importantly, the role in JADO for the Air Force, and understanding that we do not, as a service, to operations by ourselves, to enable multiple capabilities within this. The next question, sorry. Can you hear me?
Hey, sir, we're having you broken and pretty unreadable there. Over.
Give me 2 seconds.
Roger.
How do you have me now? Okay, sorry, I had to connect to the Wi-Fi. The reception out here is pretty terrible. Okay, so did you get my final answer for question number 2? Sorry, question number 3 about MDO versus JADO?
Negative, sir. That was all unreadable.
Okay, so for how do we prevent JADO from becoming MDO? Just kind of a catchphrase. So when the Chief of Staff of the Air Force directed us to take a look at writing all domain operations, he very clearly told us, I don't want the Air Force writing about multi-domain operations. I want our airmen to always be thinking in the joint nature from the get-go. So even though the Army writes MDO, we were told not to. And again, the highest 4-star in the Air Force trumped our decision. And so we wrote it as Department of the Air Force support to joint all domain operations, understanding that the Air Force by itself will never do JADO completely, but all of our actions in the domains that we control will affect all domains. So that's why it's joint all domain operations. Again, the 4-star said do it, that's the way we wrote it. As to the joint tasking cycle and by extension, the KEC itself evolving to optimize the JIT2 concept, the big thing about this, we're actually doing a war game next month. We're bringing in experts from the 505th, ACC, the Warfare Center, et cetera, to actually test this. So we're going to be doing a tabletop exercise for about 5 days next month. We're going to be looking at getting rid of the idea of the ATO and going more towards a integrated tasking order, the ITO. And what we're going to be looking at is combining kinetic and non-kinetic effects from the very beginning of planning, not figure out what we're going to do kinetic strikes against, then how do we sprinkle on some space, cyber, and electromagnetic spectrum effects after the fact. Tying that together, we're also recommending that the AOC stops being a purely Air Force weapon system. It needs to be more of controlled by the JFAC at the behest of the Joint Force Commander, and truly bring in experts from the different services that are not just liaison officers, but people that can make decisions real time. Because as you start looking at a contested environment against a peer adversary, the idea of a static 5,000 person AOC that's not going to be hampered in any way, we all realize is just not going to happen. We had an opportunity last year to go out and have action with General Brown, our new CSAF, and he gave us a very clear direction on what he expects to see for command and control going forward, to include it not really centralized control, decentralized execution, but centralized planning, basically disaggregated control, and then distributed execution. So what you're looking at is using ideas like mission command, commander's intent, providing the authorities delegated down to the lowest commander possible, so that in a contested environment where we know we're going to not have clear communication, the commanders can assume risk, make the decision, execute, and fight their way back to clear communication with the AOC to get further direction.
Awesome.
With that being
Thank
said,
you very
the
much,
idea of
sir.
strat cell, and then
Sorry about stepping on you there, sir. I'm sorry about stepping on you there, sir. I just saw we got Dr. Mulgund back on the horn, and I was hoping we could.
Okay, I will shut up for now.
No worries. Thanks very much, sir. I appreciate the pickup game.
My pleasure.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Got you loud and clear now, sir.
Okay, I apologize for that. Actually, quite literally had a power failure at my house here. Okay, so where was I? I think I was starting to talk about the Doolittle raid. So, okay, so that's sort of ancient antiquity there that we got on the top left of this slide. Something more recent where we can start thinking about or looking at a combination of capabilities from multiple domains would be the Doolittle raid that followed the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor that launched World War II. In that case, an aircraft carrier was used as a platform for long-range projection of air power. Using B-25s that were launched from the USS Hornet, the US showed that the Japanese mainland was vulnerable to our air attacks. The B-25s couldn't have reached the Japanese mainland on their own, and the typical dive bombers of the day wouldn't have had the range to reach Japan without the Hornet getting pretty close to the mainland and putting itself at risk. So there's an example of combining forces and capabilities from multiple domains to do what each one on its own couldn't do by itself. And then, of course, Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy in 1944, was a pretty comprehensive example of today what we might call an all-domain operation, combining aerial bombardment, naval fires, physical and electronic deception to mislead the Germans where we intended to land, as well as paratrooper assault, and of course the large-scale amphibious invasion. Now, not everything went to plan, according to plan in that particular case, but it did work and it was successful. And then lastly, we can also think about this idea of multi-domain constructs and military activities that are outside of the scope of the sort of large-scale conflict that the rest of the examples on this slide represent. So for deterrence and compellence purposes. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, the US countered Russia's placement of ballistic missiles in Cuba with a range of multi-domain actions, specifically a naval blockade combined with threats of airstrikes and, of course, a land invasion that was threatened at the time as well. So again, many historical examples of what we might call a multi-domain or all-domain operations. And so again, now this begs the question then, well, what is new about all this stuff? So next slide. So what has changed then, beyond all these historical examples that I've talked through? Well, first of all, space and cyberspace have become recognized as domains of warfare. Rapid proliferation of technology has eroded the traditional US military advantages and freedom of maneuver that we talked about on the previous slide, and at least with the 3 US examples there. So for example, advanced integration of air defense systems, or advanced integrated air defense systems rather, cruise missiles that have ranges that can exceed 1,000 miles, putting many of our precious assets at risk, anti-satellite weapons, and then loitering drones for surveillance at strike. These are all sort of newer developments that make us think differently about what we need to be able to do. And then our adversaries, on top of these technological advantages that they're getting their hands on, are increasingly countering our traditional military advantages using asymmetric approaches that might include things like cyberspace attacks, and then the use of disinformation and propaganda through social media. So these are some of the forcing functions, if you will, that are making us think differently about how we approach joint operations and all domain operations the way Colonel Babcock was just describing. Next slide, please. So from my point of view, if we strip away all the buzzwords and the jargon and everything else, I would simply put to you that we can think of JADO as being the evolution of joint operations in combined arms, those traditional terms that I spoke to earlier, that account for a few variables. First, a sophisticated and rapidly changing threat environment that is putting us on our toes. The emergence of space and cyberspace as contested warfighting domains where we don't have supremacy and don't have the ability to operate where and when we want necessarily. Then the need to be able to assemble and employ forces and capabilities quickly from all domains to be able to create the freedom of maneuver we need to succeed. And then the criticality of what we're calling operations in the information environment to be able to inform domestic and global audiences, to be able to counter disinformation, propaganda, and malign influence, and then to be able to influence or deceive key foreign actors, and then finally use cyberspace for our own benefit to be able to attack and exploit networks, systems, and information. And so this one slide here would be sort of how I reduce all the jargon that we've seen on JADO and MDO and everything else to sort of very foundational things that I think are going to be somewhat enduring as we go forward. Next slide, please. Then, so I think I've heard some mention of command and control and some of the chat windows and everything else. How does command and control, a key function that the Air Force enables and supports, change as we go through this stuff? I think what we're going to see is that emerging organizations, capabilities and concepts are going to introduce complexities into how we conduct the command and control of these kinds of operations. The traditional AOC that many of you, I'm sure, have been in has been the C2 node for what we might call the long-range fight, but that's changing. The stand-up of US Space Command and the 16th Air Force, which is going to be our numbered Air Force for information warfare, are going to create new organizations and relationships that will affect how we conduct command and control. And then outside the Air Force, the Army is exploring new concepts and capabilities for long-range fires, which are going to affect how we have to do airspace management. And a lot of these things are in flux with both the Army's plans and what's happening with Spacecom and the 16th Air Force. And so I think that a lot of collaboration and experimentation across all these organizations is going to be pretty key to figuring out what is going to work effectively as a long-term approach for the Joint Force to be able to get at what we are calling JADO. Next slide, please. So what makes all this stuff difficult? So we've talked through, you know, what are some ways of stripping away the jargon and describing JADO in very, very foundational terms. What makes this hard to do? Why can't we do this right away? Well, first of all, coming up with an understanding, an operational picture, of, if you will, of the operating environment that spans all domains is very, very difficult to do for technical and organizational reasons. The tools and processes that we have for planning don't necessarily support effective collaboration across organizations and disciplines and different time horizons for getting stuff done. Being able to delegate authorities to the level needed for responsive action is kind of difficult today. A lot of authorities when it comes to space and cyberspace and even information operations are held at very, very high levels within the United States government. They aren't necessarily things that are available to a tactical commander to be able to employ on their own. And so that's going to be something that is going to require a careful look to understand where do we need to be able to put authorities so that we can be effective at doing this stuff in the timeframes that are required. And then lastly, you've heard a lot from the Air Force talking about connecting all sensors to all shooters across all domains. Our ability to do that today is kind of limited. We're starting to experiment with it. We're starting to make progress on it, but we are far away from this vision of what might be called a grid that connects everything to everything else. So these are some of the challenges that we have to address to bring some of these ideas to life. Next slide, please. So where are we today in the Air Force? I think I heard Colonel Babcock referring to the Joint All-Domain Operations Doctrine that they've published in the LeMay Center. And so the Air Force has put that out to frame how air and space forces support JADO, and that language is very specific. I think I heard him referring to the fact that the Air Force or Air and Space Forces are not necessarily going to conduct joint all-domain operations on their own, but we will be a key part of it and we will be supporting it. And so the language that you will see in that doctrine kind of reflects that perspective. On the top right there, the Air Force Warfighting Integration Capability at Headquarters Air Force is developing an overall JADC2 concept to guide future force design, kind of 7 years out, sort of taking a long-term view of how do we build the force that we need to get after some of this stuff. At Hurlburt, at the 505th Command Control Wing, at the bottom left there, they're building a cadre of multi-domain operations experts to what's been called the new 13 Oscar career field. And so they started that about a year ago based on some of the earlier work that I helped to support on multi-domain operations. Some of that stuff fed into some of the training curriculum for that 13 Oscar career field. And so now they are starting to graduate students who are getting out to the air operations centers around the world to bring to bear some of this expertise that we need to tackle some of these challenges. And then finally, from a technical point of view, the Air Force is looking at developing a range of capabilities to enable better linking sensors to shooters, the way I described on the previous slide, to a resilient architecture that will hopefully hold up under attacks from our adversaries who would very much like to prevent us from being able to connect all sensors to shooters. And so then this last slide then, next slide. Yep, thank you. Yeah, so where can you learn more? So the Air Force has actually created a community of interest at the link at the bottom there, where you can go to get your hands on articles and reports on what's been going on, reference documents such as this doctrine, lists of upcoming events that you can plug into to learn what's going on, and then to be able to connect with kindred spirits who are interested in tackling this sort of thing themselves. So I'd invite you all to look at that link and see what's there that might be of interest to you. And so I think that's the final slide. So let me stop there and turn it over to all of you for questions.
All right, thanks very much, sir. I sure do appreciate that. Lots to chew on there with JADO, especially with a lot of the terminology and making sure that everybody's kind of speaking the same language. I'd like to turn it over to Josh Williams here for our first question. We'll just pitch it right into the crowd. So Josh, you should be able to unmute, and it's over to you.
Hey, sir, can you hear me?
I can.
Awesome. Hey, Captain Joshua Suggs Williams. I am currently stationed at the UABMT Schoolhouse in Tyndall. So teaching new LTs how to earn their wings, do tactical command and control. We're a little bit different from most other undergraduate flying trainings like RPA, CISO, and pilot because we're teaching strategy and tactics from almost day one. So I'm interested in what steps we can take to help increase the multi/joint domain operations mindedness, stuff that is going to affect these students later on in their air battle management careers. The challenge we have right now is that they've optimized their syllabus. So most of your flying training programs, 11 to 12 months. This one was previously 9 months. They optimized our syllabus down to 6 months, and our instructor manning is like 65%. So my question to you would be if I could talk to my DOW shop and kind of give them like 3 tangible, like either actions or steps that we could take to help increase the forward thinking of our students for multi-domain as opposed to just tactical air command and control, what would those steps be? And what would you really ratchet down on?
That's a good question. So I think one of the areas there would be how can we think from a multi-domain point of view, so that this whole language connecting sensor to shooters, how do we think about using the platforms that you guys control as ways of gathering opportunistic ISR? And so how do we connect Intel and Ops together more fluidly? Because those tend to be in somewhat separate stovepipes and separate time horizons and everything else. So I would say, sort of with the capabilities that we have today, what are some new ideas and new concepts that we could develop that would enable us to better link Intel and Ops together through the platforms that you have at your disposal? I think that would be one area. I think another one would be better understanding how can we tie together the planning cycles that you guys have, that you're using, with some of the other ones that are out there. I think a big challenge with all this is understanding how does the air tasking cycle need to evolve to support this way of operating, and to get out that there needs to be a pretty broad shared understanding of what are all the different kinds of assets that we have out there, what do their own planning cycles look like, and then how do we tie them together in a way that can be effective. So those are two off the top of my head that I can think of.
Okay, thank you for that, sir. Appreciate it. Looking forward to getting on the site and pulling some of that info together.
Awesome, thanks, Josh. Kind of keeping on the C2 theme here. So we heard a little bit from Colonel Babcock about how they're looking to reimagine the ATO and the Joint Air Tasking Cycle. And I was wondering if you would mind giving us your perspective on kind of a similar concept here. So how do you see the ATO and the JATC cycle evolving as we move into more of a JATO and a JADC2 construct?
Yes, I think before we talk about the cycle, let's talk a little bit about the processes. One of the things that that we've seen in our engagement in this area is that when you are trying to run this kind of integrated planning process, what can be an obstacle to working that way is language. One of the things that we've seen is that space guys and gals, cyber guys and gals, the air domain folks come to the table with very, very different vocabularies for how we talk about capabilities and effects and everything else. And so one of the things that we've tried to promote in some of the JATO doctrine and some of the modifications that we've made to AOC TTPs over the years has been to try to normalize that language so that everybody is talking in common terms as part of a planning process, so that when you convene a group that is bringing together many different kinds of expertise, they can actually have a conversation with each other to say, how can our different respective capabilities come together to be effective? So that's sort of one thing that is part of that cycle. Now, from a pure time point of view, I think another part of it would be to understand that these time horizons are very, very different. One of the diagrams that's in that JATO doctrine that was on one of the previous slides pointed out that, there's a picture in there that we helped put together that points out that these different capabilities that we're talking about, whether it's space, whether it's cyber, whether it's the IO, whether it's tactical air, whether it's mobility or strategic air, they all have very different planning horizons. And so if you are trying to bring together, if you're trying to converge effects at a particular time and place, whether it's tomorrow or the day after tomorrow or next month, understanding that if we want to bring all those forces together at a certain time, we have to start that planning process well in advance. And so it might not be something where if we need it tomorrow, starting the planning process today will work. And so part of that tasking cycle has to be to recognize that you've got to start early with some of these things to be able to use the stuff when you want it. And so having that be part of how we think about these planning cycles will be an important piece of it going forward. So that's not necessarily within the confines of that 24-hour cycle. It's really thinking more broadly to say, if we want that 24-hour planning cycle to work, there's a bunch of things that we have to do well in advance of that to be able to converge the things that we are after.
Thank you, sir. And I think that feeds right into another question we have from the audience here. You mentioned that we have, one issue we have is that we don't have planning processes that span all domains that are integrated, kind of speaking back to the time horizon issue that you just mentioned. In Intel right now, we do have some machine learning, some AI that helps them sift down a narrow target selection and do those sorts of things. Do you see AI being able to assist in applying force across all domains and building those moments of convergence?
I think it can. I mean, I think this is an area where we are just starting to learn what's possible. I think it can help in understanding what are trade-offs. I think maybe there might be potential in understanding or being able to use some of those things for risk analysis. For example, a lot of times in an AOC, the analyses that people put together on risk to mission, risk to force, and other such considerations can be very subjective because they are done under extreme time pressure. If you could maybe use AI as part of electronic wargaming to look at